My coworker followed me to the parking lot and said, "I found your name in a file that shouldn't exist. Meet me tomorrow alone." The first thing I noticed was how Priya's hands were shaking when she grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into the sleeve of my jacket hard enough to leave marks I would find later that night. She was always composed, always professional, the kind of person who sent perfectly formatted emails with bullet points and never raised her voice even when the servers crashed during quarterly reports. But in that parking lot, under the flickering orange lights of the Meridian Technologies employee garage at 7:43 p.m. on a Wednesday, she looked like someone who had seen something that couldn't be unseen. Her eyes kept darting toward the security camera mounted on the concrete pillar 20 feet away, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, even though we were the only two people on the entire third level. I asked her what she meant about a file. What file? Whose file? And she just shook her head so hard that a strand of hair came loose from her usually immaculate bun. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm and closed my fingers around it. "Tomorrow," she said again. "The coffee shop on Brennan Street. The one with the blue awning, 6:30 a.m. before anyone from work could possibly see us." Then she was gone, walking toward her car with the kind of controlled speed that made it clear she was fighting the urge to run. I'd been working at Meridian Technologies for 3 years and 4 months when that happened, long enough to know the rhythms of the place, the politics, the unwritten rules about which executives to avoid in the elevator and which break rooms had the best coffee. It was a mid-sized data analytics firm in the Research Triangle area of North Carolina, the kind of company that had motivational posters about innovation in the lobby and a turnover rate that suggested the culture wasn't quite as positive as the Glassdoor reviews claimed. I was a senior systems analyst in the infrastructure department, which meant I spent most of my days maintaining servers, troubleshooting network issues, and trying to explain to middle management why their requests for real-time data dashboards would require more than a weekend to implement. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well enough that I'd been able to put a down payment on a house in Cary the previous year, and the health insurance was good, which mattered more than I wanted to admit after my father's heart attack had left him with medical bills that nearly bankrupted my parents. I was 34 years old, single, reasonably content with my life in the way that people are when they've stopped expecting miracles and started appreciating stability. Priya Nair had joined the company about 8 months before that night in the parking lot, transferring from the Boston office to lead a new compliance initiative that nobody really understood. She worked in a department called Internal Risk Assessment, which occupied the 4th floor and required a special key card that most employees didn't have. I knew her the way you know coworkers in a company of 300 people, nodding in hallways, making small talk in the lunch line, occasionally ending up at the same table during mandatory team-building events. She was smart, quiet, Indian-American with a slight Boston accent, maybe 30 years old, and she had this way of listening to people that made you feel like she was actually paying attention, rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. We'd had exactly one real conversation, about 6 weeks earlier, when we'd both gotten stuck waiting for the elevator during a fire drill that turned out to be a false alarm. She'd mentioned she was working on a project that was giving her headaches, something about data retention policies, and I'd made some forgettable joke about corporate bureaucracy. That was it. That was the extent of our relationship before she grabbed my arm in that parking lot and told me my name was in a file that shouldn't exist. The piece of paper she'd given me contained 3 things: a date from 4 years ago, a string of numbers that looked like some kind of identifier code, and the words, Project Lighthouse, written in handwriting so small I had to squint to read it. I sat in my car for 15 minutes after she left, staring at those words, trying to make them mean something. 4 years ago, I hadn't even worked at Meridian. I'd been at a smaller firm in Durham, a startup that had eventually been acquired by a bigger company and dissolved. There was no reason my name should appear in any Meridian file from that time period. There was no reason Priya should look that scared about a piece of corporate paperwork. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, maybe a clerical error, maybe she'd misread something, maybe the stress of her job had made her paranoid about things that were perfectly innocent. But I couldn't shake the image of her hands shaking, her eyes on that security camera, the way she'd said tomorrow like it was the most important word in the English language. I barely slept that night, which meant I was exhausted when I pulled into the parking lot of the coffee shop on Brennan Street at 6:17 a.m. the next morning, early enough that the sun was just starting to turn the sky pink behind the strip mall across the street. The place was called Blue Door Coffee, a local chain that served decent lattes and had the advantage of being far enough from Meridian's campus that running into colleagues was unlikely. Priya was already there when I walked in, sitting at a corner table with her back to the wall and a clear sightline to both exits. She had a laptop open in front of her, but the screen was angled away from the window, and she didn't look up until I was standing directly across from her. When she did, I saw that she hadn't slept either. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she was gripping her coffee cup with both hands, like she needed something to hold on to. She gestured for me to sit, and I did, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then she turned the laptop toward me and said, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to show you could get us both fired. It could get us both arrested. And if I'm right about what I think I've found, it could be a lot worse than that." The file was labeled with a string of alphanumeric characters that meant nothing to me, but when Priya opened it, I recognized my own face immediately. It was a photograph from my previous employer's badge system, dated 3 years before I started at Meridian, attached to a dossier that contained more personal information than I'd ever given any company. My social security number, my medical history including a knee surgery from college, and the antidepressants I'd been prescribed after a bad breakup in my 20s, my credit score, my phone records going back 5 years, even transcripts of text messages I'd sent to friends and family members. There were notes in the margins written by someone with the initials GTW, analyzing my psychology, my spending habits, my relationships, my vulnerabilities. One section was titled Leverage Points and listed my father's medical debt, my mother's immigration status as a naturalized citizen, and the fact that I'd once been questioned by police about a bar fight I hadn't started and wasn't charged for. Another section described me as isolated, financially motivated, low resistance threshold. The timestamp on the file was from 14 months before Meridian had even posted the job listing I'd applied to. My mouth went dry. I could feel my pulse in my temples, a throbbing that made it hard to think clearly. I asked Priya what this was, who had created this, why any company would have this kind of information about an employee they hadn't even hired yet. She took a long breath and told me that 6 weeks ago, she'd been asked to audit a legacy database as part of her compliance work, a routine task that was supposed to identify outdated files that could be deleted to free up server space. Instead, she'd found a hidden partition that required administrator credentials she wasn't supposed to have, credentials she'd obtained through a security vulnerability she'd reported 3 times without anyone fixing it. Inside that partition was a folder called Project Lighthouse containing dossiers on over 200 individuals, some of them current Meridian employees, some of them former employees, some of them people who had never worked at the company at all. The files dated back almost a decade. They contained surveillance data, psychological profiles, financial records, and detailed assessments of each person's usefulness and controllability. And at the bottom of each file was a recommendation: recruit, monitor, or neutralize. I asked her what neutralize meant. She said she didn't know for certain, but 7 of the people in the database had their files marked with that word, and when she'd searched for them, she'd found that 3 had died in accidents, 2 had been arrested on charges that later turned out to be fabricated, and 2 had simply disappeared without any record of what happened to them. The blood drained from my face. I looked at my own file again, at the recommendation written at the bottom in the same clinical font as everything else: recruit, high value, authorized for long-term integration. I'd been selected, profiled, manipulated into applying for a job I thought I'd found through a routine search on LinkedIn. My entire career at Meridian had been engineered by someone who knew more about me than I knew about myself. Priya explained that she'd spent the past 6 weeks trying to understand what Project Lighthouse actually was, working after hours, covering her tracks, terrified that whoever had created this database would discover she'd found it. What she'd pieced together was this: Meridian Technologies was not just a data analytics company. It was a front for something else, something that had been operating in the shadows for at least a decade, using the legitimate business as cover for activities that went far beyond corporate espionage. The company's real clients weren't the Fortune 500 firms listed on the website. They were government agencies, private intelligence contractors, and individuals with enough money to pay for information that no one was supposed to have. Meridian collected data on everyone: employees, clients, competitors, anyone who crossed their radar for any reason. They built profiles, identified vulnerabilities, and sold access to people who wanted to exploit those vulnerabilities for their own purposes. The employees who worked there, people like me, were selected because we had skills that were useful and weaknesses that made us controllable. We were assets, not workers. I asked her why she was telling me this, why she'd chosen me out of all the people in that database. She said it was because my file was different from the others. Most of the dossiers focused on external targets, people outside the company who were being surveilled for clients. But mine was internal, and it had been flagged with a note I couldn't see from where I was sitting. She scrolled down, and I felt my stomach drop when I read it. Subject shows aptitude for systems-level access. Recommend integration into Lighthouse technical team within 18 to 24 months. Monitor for security risks. Someone was planning to recruit me into the actual operation to make me complicit in whatever they were doing. And according to the timestamps, they were planning to approach me within the next 6 months. I spent the next 3 days in a state of controlled panic, going to work like nothing had changed, sitting at my desk, maintaining the servers, attending meetings about quarterly projections, while my mind raced through everything Priya had told me. She'd made a copy of the files before our meeting, encrypted it, and hidden it in a location she refused to tell me about in case either of us was compromised. We agreed to communicate only through a messaging app with end-to-end encryption, using code words we'd established, and to never discuss anything related to Lighthouse on company property or company devices. I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before: the security cameras that seemed to be everywhere, the way certain executives would appear in hallways at unexpected times, the locked doors on the 4th floor where Priya worked. I noticed that my computer activity was being monitored more closely than I'd realized, that my badge swipes were logged with a precision that seemed excessive for a company of our size. I noticed that the IT director, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had always seemed friendly and approachable, had a habit of asking questions about my personal life that felt slightly too probing to be casual conversation. On the 4th day, I made a decision that would change everything. I went to Priya's desk during lunch break, ostensibly to ask a question about a compliance form, and slipped her a note suggesting we meet again that evening. Instead, I went home, called in sick the next day, and drove 3 hours to meet with a lawyer my college roommate had recommended. Her name was Natalie Reeves, a partner at a firm in Richmond that specialized in whistleblower cases, and she had a reputation for taking on clients that other lawyers considered too risky. I told her everything, showed her printouts of the files Priya had found, and watched her expression shift from skepticism to concern to something that looked almost like fear. She asked me questions for 2 hours, took notes on a legal pad, and finally told me that if even half of what I was describing was true, we were dealing with something that went far beyond corporate misconduct. This was potentially criminal conspiracy, she said, possibly involving federal agencies, possibly involving people with enough power to make problems disappear. Natalie connected me with an investigative journalist named Diana Cho, who worked for a national publication and had broken several major stories about corporate surveillance and government overreach. Diana was cautious, rightfully paranoid, and insisted on meeting in person at a location she chose herself, a park bench in a small town halfway between Richmond and Raleigh, where neither of us had any connection. She was in her early 40s, Korean-American, with sharp eyes and a voice recorder that she kept running throughout our conversation. I told her what I'd found, what Priya had found, what we believed was happening at Meridian. She listened without interrupting, asked precise follow-up questions, and told me that she'd heard rumors about operations like this before, but had never been able to find proof. If I could get her documentation, verifiable documentation that could withstand legal scrutiny, she would publish the story. But she warned me that the people behind something like this wouldn't go down quietly. They would fight back with everything they had, and the first thing they would do was try to discredit or destroy anyone who threatened to expose them. I went back to work on Monday with a plan that Natalie and Diana had helped me develop. The goal was to gather as much evidence as possible before Meridian realized what we were doing, to create multiple copies stored in multiple secure locations, and to build a case strong enough that publishing it would be legally defensible. Priya was essential to this plan because she had the access I didn't, the compliance credentials that let her move through parts of the company's infrastructure that were locked to everyone else. We started meeting twice a week, always off-site, always using different locations, and she would bring me fragments of data that I would piece together into a larger picture. I learned about the company's real ownership structure, a web of shell corporations and offshore accounts that traced back to individuals I recognized from news articles about defense contracting and political lobbying. I learned about the clients who paid for Meridian's services, names that included a sitting congressman, a tech billionaire, and a former intelligence official who had gone into private consulting. I learned about the employees who had been neutralized, and I found evidence suggesting that at least one of the accidents had been staged. 6 weeks into this investigation, Priya stopped responding to my messages. I went to work the next day and found her desk empty, her computer logged out, her personal items gone. When I asked her manager what had happened, he told me she'd resigned unexpectedly to deal with a family emergency in Boston. I knew immediately that it was a lie. Priya had told me her parents lived in California, not Boston, and she never would have left without warning me first. I called her personal cell phone and got a message saying the number had been disconnected. I drove to her apartment that evening and found it empty, a for rent sign in the window, all her furniture gone. It was like she'd never existed at all. I sat in my car outside her building for an hour, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't hold my phone steady, and I understood finally what we were up against. These people didn't just ruin lives, they erased them. I contacted Diana and Natalie that night and told them what had happened. Diana was alarmed but not surprised. She said this was consistent with how these operations worked, that they identified threats and eliminated them before they could cause damage. The question now was whether they knew about me, whether Priya had given them my name under whatever pressure they'd applied, or whether I still had time to finish what we'd started. Natalie advised me to document everything, to create a dead man's switch that would release the files automatically if something happened to me, and to consider going to law enforcement. But going to the police felt dangerous when we didn't know how deep the corruption went, when Meridian's client list included people with the power to interfere with any investigation. I decided to keep gathering evidence, but I started sleeping with a bag packed by my door, ready to run if I needed to. 3 days later, Gerald Whitmore asked me to come to his office for what he called a career development conversation. I'd been avoiding him since Priya's disappearance, but refusing the meeting would have raised suspicions I couldn't afford. I walked into his corner office on the 6th floor, with my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, and I sat across from him while he smiled that friendly, approachable smile and asked how I was enjoying my work at Meridian. We talked for 20 minutes about server architecture and team dynamics and opportunities for advancement, and the whole time I was watching his eyes, looking for any sign that he knew what I'd been doing. Then, just as I was starting to think I might be safe, he leaned forward and said something that made my blood run cold. He said he'd noticed I'd been under a lot of stress lately, that I'd been distracted, that my performance had slipped in ways that concerned him. He said the company cared about its employees and wanted to help me through whatever I was dealing with. He said if I ever needed to talk about anything at all, his door was always open. The way he emphasized the word anything made it clear that this wasn't about my job performance. It was a warning. I lasted 2 more weeks before everything fell apart. It happened on a Friday afternoon when I was supposed to be in a meeting about infrastructure upgrades, but had slipped away to copy files from a server I'd discovered contained backup data from the lighthouse partition. I thought I'd covered my tracks, used credentials I'd obtained the same way Priya had, but I'd underestimated how closely I was being watched. I was halfway through the transfer when my screen went black, replaced by a single message in white text. Access revoked. Report to HR immediately. I stared at those words for maybe 10 seconds, my mind racing through options, and then I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the USB drive from my computer, shoved it in my pocket, and walked out of the building without stopping at HR, without stopping for anything. I got in my car, drove to the highway, and didn't look back until I was 50 miles away. Detective Raymond Okonkwo, 23 years with the FBI's Cyber Division, became involved in my case when Diana Cho's editors decided the story was too big to publish without official confirmation. They'd reached out to federal law enforcement through back channels, and Okonkwo had been assigned to investigate the allegations. He was a tall man in his 50s, methodical and soft-spoken, with the kind of patience that suggested he'd seen enough to know that the truth usually took time to emerge. We met for the first time at a safe house Natalie had arranged, and I spent 6 hours walking him through everything I knew, everything Priya had found, everything I'd pieced together in the months since that night in the parking lot. He asked questions I hadn't thought to ask, identified connections I hadn't noticed, and told me that what we were describing matched patterns his unit had been tracking for years. A shadow network of private intelligence firms that operated outside any legal framework, selling surveillance and influence to the highest bidder. The FBI investigation took 4 months, during which I lived in a series of rented rooms under an assumed name, working remotely for a cybersecurity firm that Natalie had connected me with, checking over my shoulder constantly for signs that Meridian had found me. Diana stayed in touch, updating me on the progress of her reporting, telling me that her team had confirmed many of the details I'd provided and found additional evidence I hadn't known about. They'd located former Meridian employees who were willing to talk, people who had left the company years ago and carried stories they'd been too afraid to tell. They'd obtained financial records showing payments from Meridian to individuals connected to political campaigns and government agencies. They'd found Priya Nair alive and in witness protection, cooperating with federal investigators, her disappearance staged by the FBI to protect her while they built their case. The relief I felt when Diana told me that knowing Priya was safe was so overwhelming that I had to sit down to keep from falling over. The story broke on a Sunday morning in late October, published simultaneously by Diana's outlet and 3 other major news organizations that had been collaborating on the investigation. The headline read, "Shadow Intelligence Firm Operated Inside Tech Company for Decade, FBI Says." The article named names, Gerald Whitmore as the operational director of Project Lighthouse, the company's CEO as a knowing participant who had provided cover for the operation, the clients who had paid millions for access to illegally obtained personal data. It included excerpts from the files Priya and I had found, redacted to protect innocent people, but damning enough to leave no doubt about what had happened. It quoted Detective Okonkwo confirming that multiple arrests were imminent and that the investigation had expanded to include potential charges of racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy, and violations of federal surveillance laws. By noon, Meridian's stock had dropped 40%, and by evening, the CEO had resigned and Gerald Whitmore had been taken into custody at his home in Chapel Hill. I watched the aftermath unfold from a hotel room in Chicago, where I'd relocated while the legal proceedings were being sorted out. Natalie kept me updated on the charges being filed, 18 indictments in total, including executives, clients, and government officials who had received information they knew was illegally obtained. Gerald Whitmore's bail was set at $5 million, which he posted within hours, but the evidence against him was overwhelming, including recordings that Priya had made during meetings she'd been forced to attend, recordings that captured him discussing the neutralization of individuals who posed threats to the operation. The 3 deaths I'd wondered about were being reinvestigated as potential homicides, and while proving murder would be difficult after so many years, the FBI was confident that additional charges would be forthcoming. The congressman on Meridian's client list resigned within a week, citing personal reasons. The tech billionaire's company faced a shareholder revolt that would eventually force him out. The former intelligence official disappeared, which suggested he had connections deep enough to help him escape, but Okonkwo told me they were tracking him and expected to make an arrest within months. The trial began the following spring, and I was called as a witness for the prosecution. I spent 3 days on the stand, walking through the files I'd found, the meetings with Priya, the moment I'd realized my entire career at Meridian had been engineered by people who saw me as a tool to be used. The defense tried to discredit me, suggesting I was a disgruntled employee fabricating evidence to get revenge for being fired, but the documentation was too extensive and too corroborated for their attacks to land. Priya testified as well, composed and precise, describing how she'd discovered Project Lighthouse and the fear she'd felt when she understood what it meant. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major counts. Gerald Whitmore was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The CEO received 15. 4 other executives received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. The clients were tried separately, and while some received lighter sentences due to cooperation agreements, None of them escaped accountability entirely. I returned to North Carolina after the trial, not to the house I'd owned before this started, which I'd sold during the months I spent in hiding, but to a small apartment in a town where nobody knew my name. The experience had changed me in ways I was still discovering, made me suspicious of institutions I'd trusted, of systems I'd assumed were designed to protect people rather than exploit them. I started working as an independent consultant, helping organizations improve their cybersecurity and data protection practices, which felt like a way of turning what I'd learned into something useful. Natalie told me I could probably sue Meridian's estate for damages, that the settlement would be substantial, but I wasn't interested in money. What I wanted was the knowledge that the people who had built their careers on surveilling and manipulating others were finally facing consequences. What I wanted was to know that the next person who found their name in a file that shouldn't exist might have a better chance of being believed. Priya and I stayed in touch after everything was over. We met for coffee occasionally, two people bonded by an experience that no one else could fully understand. She'd taken a job with a nonprofit focused on digital privacy rights, using her expertise to help others protect themselves from the kind of intrusion we'd both experienced. She told me once that she still had nightmares about those weeks after she found the files, the constant fear that she was being watched, the uncertainty about whether anyone would believe her if she came forward. But she also told me she didn't regret any of it. Exposing the truth had cost her nearly everything, her job, her sense of safety, months of her life spent in hiding, but it had also revealed who she really was, someone who chose transparency over self-preservation, who risked everything because staying silent felt worse than speaking up. I understood that feeling. I lived with it every day. The last time I heard Gerald Whitmore's name was in a news article about his appeal being denied. He'd argued that the evidence against him had been obtained illegally, that Priya's access to the Lighthouse files constituted hacking, that the whole case should be thrown out on procedural grounds. The court disagreed, noting that Priya had reported the security vulnerability multiple times and that her access to the files was consistent with her compliance responsibilities. The conviction stood. He would spend at least 2 more decades in prison, longer than the time he'd spent building the operation that had destroyed so many lives. When I read that article, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a kind of quiet relief. The system had worked, eventually. Not perfectly, not quickly, but it had worked. The people who thought they were above accountability had been held accountable. The files that shouldn't have existed had been destroyed. And the coworker who had followed me to that parking lot, who had been brave enough to trust me with what she'd found, was safe and free and using her voice to prevent others from going through what we had endured. Sometimes, I still think about that night in the parking lot, the flickering orange lights, Priya's shaking hands, the piece of paper she pressed into my palm. I think about how easily I could have dismissed her, could have told myself she was paranoid or mistaken, could have gone home and forgotten the whole thing. I think about the version of me who existed before that moment, the one who trusted that corporations were just businesses and that his personal information was his own. That version of me is gone now, replaced by someone warier, more aware of the systems that operate in shadows while the rest of us go about our ordinary lives. But I don't regret losing him. The truth, even when it's terrifying, is better than the comfortable ignorance that lets monsters like Gerald Whitmore thrive. If you made it this far, hit like, you've earned it.